This just got ugly. Brittney Griner and Caitlin Clark are suddenly at the center of another explosive WNBA conversation, and Sophie Cunningham is right in the middle of it. After a physical moment involving Clark sent fans into a frenzy, social media immediately started asking whether Griner had crossed the line. And then everyone's attention turned to Sophie Cunningham. Because if there's one thing Fever fans have learned about Sophie, it's that she isn't afraid to stand up for her teammates.
To go against biological men. Just can you expand your viewpoint on that?
I mean, I think I said what I said. I think it's kind of common sense. And I think I'll always believe in that. I think it's really important to protect children.
But here's the twist. The actual evidence doesn't confirm that Sophie publicly launched a direct attack on Griner or delivered the explosive statement being claimed in viral headlines. What we do know is that Griner and Cunningham already have history as former teammates, and their competitive relationship has attracted attention before. In July, the two were even caught sharing a pregame moment before Connecticut faced Indiana. So why are fans suddenly acting like a war has erupted? Because Caitlin Clark's name changes everything. Every hard screen. Every physical collision. Every stare down. Every disagreement gets analyzed frame by frame.
Yes, they're going after trans people in sports, and they're using this as a wedge issue because we love sports and, you know, we don't want our little girls to be unsafe in sports. And it's like, unsafe from who? But okay. Yeah. But now we're using this as like an overarching thing when really what we're attacking women. We're saying, if you look like this as a...
And when a superstar like Clark is involved, the reaction becomes 10 times bigger. Now fans are asking, did Brittney Griner really cross a line with Clark? Was the contact simply part of physical basketball? And if Cunningham believes her teammate was targeted, will she actually respond? Because Sophie has already built a reputation as one of Indiana's most outspoken competitors. And if she decides to address this situation directly, the WNBA internet could absolutely explode. So today, we are breaking down what actually happened, what Griner has said about playing against Cunningham, why fans are connecting all the dots, and whether this is really a feud, or another example of social media turning one basketball moment into a massive controversy. Because the next detail makes this situation even more interesting. Before the internet turned this into another WNBA war, there was already a history between Sophie Cunningham and Brittney Griner. The two aren't strangers. They were teammates in Phoenix before Cunningham eventually joined the Indiana Fever, and that history makes their interactions especially interesting now that Cunningham is playing alongside Caitlin Clark. In fact, just a few weeks ago, cameras caught Cunningham and Griner sharing a pregame interaction before Indiana faced Connecticut. It looked relatively normal. But then Griner was asked about playing against Cunningham.
They wouldn't pay the
You know, but I'm rooting for Caitlin because I've been in that seat before. I've walked that road before. I hope she kills. I hope Aaliyah Boston does amazing. And we have grown-ass men and women out here doing whatever they can to try to make sure that does not happen. That is the weirdest thing in the world, but it is what it is, and I'm glad that Caitlin has a great head on her shoulder.
And her answer immediately got fans' attention. Griner described Cunningham as annoying to play against, a comment that was clearly framed around Cunningham's competitive style and the difficulty of going against a former teammate. That one word was enough for social media to start having fun with the storyline. Because everyone already knows Cunningham's reputation. She's physical. She's aggressive. She's outspoken. And since joining Indiana, she's become closely associated with protecting her teammates and bringing an edge to the Fever. Most importantly, that includes Caitlin Clark. That's why any confrontation involving Clark immediately receives a completely different level of attention. Fans aren't just watching the basketball. They are watching who stands up for Clark. And Cunningham has repeatedly embraced that competitive identity. So when viral posts began claiming that Cunningham had supposedly gone nuclear on Griner after an alleged attack on Clark, the story spread rapidly online. But there's an important problem. There is no verified evidence that Cunningham publicly launched the explosive attack on Griner described in those viral headlines. Some social media videos are using extremely dramatic titles, but those titles aren't proof that the events actually happened.
I have two little girls who play sports, who play soccer. They're young, and I see how much hard work they put into their sport, and only to have a boy or a man who they're biologically built different to come in and just play better and take your spot. Look, if you want to play in a trans league, go ahead, but not in girls' sports. Don't try to erase women and girls.
What is real is the competitive history between Cunningham and Griner, and the fact that Cunningham has become one of the Fever's most recognizable personalities alongside Clark. That distinction matters, because the actual story is already interesting enough. Two former teammates, now opponents. One playing alongside Caitlin Clark, the other trying to stop Indiana. And millions of fans watching every interaction. So the next time these players meet, don't be surprised if every stare, every screen, and every physical possession gets analyzed. Because once social media decides there's a rivalry, every little moment suddenly becomes evidence. And that's exactly why the next chapter of this story could get even more intense. But here's where this story gets really interesting. Because Brittney Griner and Sophie Cunningham aren't actually enemies. In fact, the latest verified footage shows almost the opposite. Before Indiana faced Connecticut in July, Cunningham and Griner, former Phoenix Mercury teammates, were caught sharing a light-hearted moment. Griner even recreated Cunningham's now famous pointing gesture, and the two appeared to be joking around before the game. So why are fans suddenly talking about a Cunningham-Griner feud? Because of Caitlin Clark. And that changes the entire conversation. Cunningham has developed a reputation for being one of Clark's most physical and outspoken teammates. That reputation became especially strong after an earlier incident in which Cunningham retaliated during a game after Clark was involved in a physical sequence. That history is why fans immediately start watching whenever Clark is involved in a confrontation. They don't just ask what happened. They ask, who was there? Who reacted? And who stood up for Caitlin? That's exactly why viral headlines claiming Sophie Cunningham has now fired back at Brittney Griner spread so quickly. But there's an important reality check. There is no credible report confirming that Cunningham publicly attacked Griner after Griner brutally attacked Clark. In fact, the documented relationship between Cunningham and Griner recently looked friendly, not hostile. That doesn't mean fans can't debate their competitive history. It means we shouldn't turn a viral headline into a confirmed event. And there's another fascinating detail. Griner has previously described Cunningham as an annoying opponent, but the context was clearly competitive basketball. The two were former teammates, and Griner's comment was about how difficult Cunningham can be to play against. That's very different from a personal feud. Yet social media loves turning competitive comments into dramatic storylines. One sentence becomes a clash. One hard screen becomes an attack. One reaction becomes a war. And when Caitlin Clark's name is attached, the story can explode even faster. That's the environment Cunningham is operating in right now. She's one of the Fever's most recognizable personalities. Clark is one of the league's biggest stars. And Griner remains one of the most recognizable players in women's basketball. Put those three names into the same headline and you already have a recipe for massive engagement. But now comes the real question. What actually happened when Clark and Griner were on the court together, and did Cunningham really have a reason to step in? Because once we separate the viral claims from the verified events, the story becomes much more interesting. Here's where the situation gets much more interesting. Sophie Cunningham isn't just another Fever player anymore. She's become one of the most recognizable personalities surrounding Caitlin Clark and Indiana, and that has made her every on-court interaction significantly more important. Cunningham earned the enforcer reputation after an incident involving Jace Sheldon and Clark in 2025. She was ejected after retaliating when Sheldon poked Clark in the eye, and that moment quickly became part of Cunningham's identity with Fever fans. So when fans see Cunningham involved in any physical situation around Clark, they immediately expect a response. That's exactly what happened with the latest wave of social media speculation involving Brittney Griner. But here's the reality. There is no verified evidence that Griner launched a brutal attack on Clark, or that Cunningham publicly went nuclear on Griner afterward. In fact, the most clearly documented Cunningham-Griner interaction from July looked surprisingly friendly. The two were former Phoenix Mercury teammates, and cameras caught them sharing a pregame moment before Indiana played Connecticut. Even more interestingly, Griner later described Cunningham as annoying to play against. But the context was basketball. Griner was talking about Cunningham's competitiveness and how difficult she is to deal with on the court, not announcing some personal war. And that distinction completely changes the story. Because social media sees two famous players. It sees Caitlin Clark in the middle. And suddenly a competitive comment becomes a feud. A physical play becomes an attack. And a hypothetical response becomes a breaking news headline. But there's another reason this narrative is so powerful. Cunningham has already embraced the role of a tough, physical teammate. She knows that Fever fans expect her to compete. She knows Clark is going to attract enormous attention. And she knows that every time she gets involved in a confrontation, millions of people are going to have an opinion. That's the reality of playing alongside Clark in 2026. Even the Fever themselves have had to deal with an enormous amount of attention away from basketball, with recent reporting describing the team as trying to remain focused despite the constant off-court noise. So perhaps the real story isn't that Sophie Cunningham and Brittney Griner are secretly at war. Maybe it's that their competitive history is being magnified because Caitlin Clark is involved. And that changes everything. Because Clark doesn't simply attract fans. She attracts cameras. She attracts controversy. And she turns ordinary basketball moments into national conversations. That's why the next time Indiana and Connecticut meet, fans will be watching Cunningham and Griner especially closely. Every screen, every rebound, every stare, every physical possession. Because once a rivalry narrative starts online, people begin looking for confirmation everywhere. And now there's one final question. If Griner and Cunningham really aren't enemies, why do fans keep expecting Sophie to defend Caitlin every time something happens? This is where Sophie Cunningham's reputation becomes a huge part of the story. Because before fans started connecting her name to Brittney Griner, Cunningham had already established herself as one of the Fever's most physical and outspoken players. That reputation didn't appear out of nowhere. In 2025, Cunningham was ejected against Connecticut after retaliating when Jace Sheldon poked Caitlin Clark in the eye. That moment went viral and helped create the enforcer label that still follows Cunningham today. And once fans saw that, a narrative was born. If somebody messes with Caitlin, Sophie will respond. That's why every physical incident involving Clark gets watched differently. Fans aren't simply asking whether Clark was fouled. They are looking around to see who reacts. Who walks over? Who says something? Who gets between the players? And that's exactly why Cunningham's name keeps appearing whenever Clark is involved in controversy. But there's another side to this story. Cunningham and Griner have their own history. Before Griner joined Connecticut and Cunningham became a Fever player, they were teammates in Phoenix. The two were part of the same Mercury locker room, which makes their current relationship much more complicated than a simple enemy versus enemy storyline. In fact, recent coverage showed the two having a friendly interaction before a game. And Griner's famous description of Cunningham as annoying was clearly about competing against her, not evidence of a personal feud. So when social media suddenly started portraying them as being at war, the reality was considerably more nuanced. That's important, because viral WNBA content often turns competitive tension into personal drama. A hard screen becomes an attack. A joke becomes beef. A stare becomes war. And once Caitlin Clark's name is attached, the story can explode almost instantly. There's another reason the narrative has become so powerful. Caitlin Clark is one of the biggest stars in women's basketball, and Indiana's games continue attracting enormous attention. Recent coverage has highlighted how the Fever have continued winning despite the constant off-court noise surrounding the team. So every controversial moment involving Clark gets amplified. And Cunningham understands that. She doesn't need to start a feud to become part of the story. Her reputation alone is enough. But here's the key point. There is still no verified evidence that Sophie Cunningham publicly attacked Brittney Griner over an alleged brutal attack on Clark. That specific claim remains unsupported. What we do have is a competitive history, a former teammate relationship, Cunningham's established reputation as a fierce teammate, and fans connecting those pieces into a much bigger storyline. And honestly, that's what makes this so fascinating. Because if Cunningham and Griner eventually have another intense matchup, everyone will be watching. Not because they necessarily hate each other, but because the internet has already created a storyline around them. And the moment Caitlin Clark enters that storyline, everything becomes 10 times bigger. So now the question is, will Cunningham actually respond to the latest wave of criticism, or will she simply let her basketball do the talking? Because if Sophie decides to address this publicly, fans already know exactly what they are expecting. Now we get to the part everyone wants to know. Will Sophie Cunningham actually respond to Brittney Griner? Or will she simply let the basketball speak for itself? Because the latest verified information paints a much more complicated picture than the viral headlines suggest. Griner and Cunningham were former Phoenix Mercury teammates, and when Griner was asked about facing Cunningham as an opponent in July, she described playing against her as annoying as crap, but immediately added that when Cunningham is your teammate, she's someone you wouldn't want to be without. That context changes everything. It doesn't sound like a personal war. It sounds like two extremely competitive players who know each other well. And there's another detail fans shouldn't ignore. Just before the Fever and Sun played in July, cameras caught Cunningham and Griner sharing a playful moment. The two appeared comfortable around each other despite now playing for different teams. So where did the Sophie's done with Brittney storyline come from? Mostly from the way social media has connected several different pieces. Cunningham's reputation as one of Caitlin Clark's toughest teammates. Griner's comments about Cunningham being difficult to play against. Clark's enormous popularity. And the constant expectation that Cunningham will defend Clark whenever things become physical. Put all of those ingredients together, and suddenly a competitive matchup starts looking like a personal feud. But there's no verified evidence that Cunningham has publicly declared war on Griner. And that distinction matters. Because the most interesting part of this story may actually be what happens on the court. When Indiana and Connecticut meet again, fans will be watching. They'll be watching Cunningham. They'll be watching Griner. And, of course, they'll be watching Caitlin Clark. Every screen will get analyzed. Every physical possession will be replayed. Every reaction will become a social media clip. And if one player gets tangled up with another, the internet will immediately start asking whether the rivalry has finally exploded. But maybe the smartest move for Cunningham is to do exactly what she's been doing. Play basketball. Cunningham has already shown that she's comfortable competing physically and embracing the pressure that comes with playing alongside Clark. Meanwhile, Clark herself has repeatedly made it clear that her focus is basketball rather than getting dragged into every outside controversy. Recent coverage shows the Fever trying to stay focused on the court despite a constant barrage of off-court distractions. And that could be the biggest message of all. The Fever don't necessarily need another feud. They need wins. They need chemistry. They need their stars healthy. And they need their supporting players focused. So if Cunningham really wants to send a message to Griner, the loudest response may not be a social media post. It may be what happens when the two teams meet on the court. Because that's where Cunningham can actually answer the critics. That's where Griner can answer too. And that's where Caitlin Clark can change the entire game without saying a single word. So here's the question. Do you think Sophie Cunningham and Brittney Griner actually have real beef? Or is social media turning normal competitive basketball into another WNBA war? Drop your opinion in the comments. And if you want more Caitlin Clark, Sophie Cunningham, Brittney Griner, and Indiana Fever updates, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because with this much attention surrounding the Fever, the next big moment could happen at any time.